A warm and friendly hello, welcome to lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peterson, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. We've got an excellent podcast for you as we're going to be joined in a few minutes by our good friend Rob Donaldson. He does great work over at the show/podcast, Rob's Best Bet Show, over on youtube.com/Rob Donaldson. Does a great job handicapping so many different things, whether that be baseball, whether that be college football, college basketball. We're going to be chatting with them about some of these new look conferences, what we can expect out of the Big 12 and some of those top teams as Kansas, they pick up David Coit. We're going to get his thoughts there, but we're also going to be getting his thoughts on a few of these mid-majors. He's going to talk a little bit about a team that he thinks can surprise and is going to be able to win the CAA this season. We're also going to be looking at the middle part of the Big Ten. The Big Ten, I think, is such an intriguing conference in that I think that there's going to be a ton of teams that make the NCAA tournament, but you really don't have that top flight team out in the Big Ten, and he is a bit of an Iowa basketball fan, so we're going to talk about that team. We're going to be talking about those teams that are sort of in the middle of that conference as well. And something else that we're going to be hitting upon with him as well is taking a look at the vibes that you've got with so many of these conferences, because there's no question about it. It's going to be a little bit different in terms of the tenor that we get in the Big 10, the Big 12, all these teams that add some teams. But you've got some conferences like the Horizon League, the Summit League, which I'm going to be doing a Summit League conference preview within the next few days. Expect that over the weekend, and how to be able to gauge these conferences when you see a lot of these teams perhaps go under in the Horizon League non-conference play, during conference play, being able to find some good reads on and over. We're going to be talking a lot about that, and I do want to know some of the angles that you want me to dive in upon with this podcast, because we are starting to wrap up. Well, not starting to wrap up. We certainly have wrapped up most of the player movement that we're going to be seeing for the offseason. Now, we're getting set for the upcoming season. I want to know what you want to be set on for the upcoming college basketball season. So if you do have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you, for this podcast, you have one of two ways we offer those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at Jaden_D1. Keep in mind, the name does not matter, so as per usual, please do send these into the timeline. And the other way is find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. From there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. And I beg and plead a little bit extra today just because I was scouring through trying to find any sort of real college basketball news that we got on Wednesday. We unfortunately really did not have anything whatsoever, not even in terms of like a player reclassifying or anything like that. We did not see anything in terms of the injury from our good friend John Rothstein, as he's been doing a great job reporting on some of these guys that might be a little bit slow in coming back from injury from the previous year, taking a look at these teams that are on foreign tours, what have you. So a little bit brutal on that front, but it is always great to be joined by a guy in Rob Donaldson. I do have to take one break on this podcast, so we'll take it here, and then you'll get a fresh chat with Rob on the flip side, right here on Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peterson, now a part of the VSiN Family Podcast. And we're back here in lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peterson, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast, and it's always great to be joined by this man as we're being joined by Rob Donaldson. He does such great work over at the show/podcast, Rob's Best Bet Show. Take a look this time of year at baseball, but I know that he's getting all set for the college football season, all 12 months out of the year. He, much like myself, getting set for college basketball as well, and you're able to follow him on Twitter/X at RobDFB altogether. And Rob, it is always a pleasure, my friend. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me on, man. And certainly we're gearing up for a lot of different things right now, but college basketball is also knocking on the front door there, too, of the season starting. And that's just the crazy thing is it's always go, go, go in this industry.
Oh, it certainly is. And as we get closer and closer to the NFL season, the college basketball season, that means that we're getting closer and closer to the college basketball campaign as well. And Rob, when it comes to Kansas, I think that they're going to be such a fun team to watch this season, as we did see them over the last, we're going to call it week and a half or so, pick up David Coit, a 20.5 point per game scorer over at Northern Illinois. And we recall last year, Kansas had great top-end talent, but they didn't necessarily have a lot of depth. Now with them adding depth, how do you view them for the upcoming season? Because it just feels like Bill Self, whenever there is a weakness in this game, whenever there's something that goes wrong the previous year, he does so much to be able to address it, and has done that here in the offseason.
And that's why he's a great coach. And also on top of that, When you have an abundance of talent like Kansas does every single year, well, you're easily obviously reloading that talent, and they even retained and had a lot of that continuity left over. So I think they're sitting in an amazing spot to really do some damage. And when you look at the roster just from a talent on paper standpoint, if they have the chemistry, this is probably going to be one of the more talented rosters, if not the most talented roster in college basketball. And for that reason, I think they're going to be back on top of the college basketball world this season.
Yeah, with Kansas, I think that they're going to be rock solid out there in a Big 12 where I just take a look at this conference and I think that they have the propensity to have 5 teams in the top 12. Obviously, Baylor is going to be really good. I love the way that they've been able to operate this offseason. Houston is Houston. That goes without saying. But additionally, with Iowa State and just the great defense that they're able to play, their team that's going a little bit under the radar, in my opinion. I think that they're going to be right there. And you throw in there Arizona, and you've got yourself 5 teams that I think are going to be right there when it comes to the second week of March.
Absolutely. I think this is the perfect season. It's really a culmination point of here's what NIL has done. Teams are getting good at manipulating it. The high school recruits are still feeding up into these programs, and now you have that knowledge of how to balance everything out. And this is where I think we're going to really see just really great competition across the board, not just a UConn steamrolling through every single team they play. And the second point, I think we're going to see competition across the board and just high-level basketball play. And that's the point that really gets me excited.
Yep, I am right there with you. And I do think that battle for the great state of Iowa that we see year in and year out, because Iowa and Iowa State every single year they play each other. Think that it might be a little bit lopsided there, but as we've talked about the Big 12 so much in this offseason, how about if we do take a look at your favorite school in the Iowa Hawkeyes, as we do have Rob Donaldson, who does great work with the Rob's That Sped Show, joining me right here on Coast to Coast Hoops, because I look at the Big Ten and I don't know if you're necessarily going to have that top 5 or so team like Purdue, Michigan State. I think that they're perhaps top 10, top 15 teams. And Indiana's a really interesting bunch as well. They and Illinois, I think they're going to be there when it's all said and done, but I can't feel good about putting them in a top 10, perhaps a top 15, top 20, but I'm not there in terms of the top 10. But I look at the Big Ten and I see a lot of fringe top 25 teams. I see a lot of teams that would probably be 8, 9 seeds in the NCAA tournament, but I really don't see that top flight team like we've seen the last few years in Purdue.
Yeah, and even when you look at the bottom of the Big Ten in terms of the projections, right? It's in Maryland, it's Penn State, it's Minnesota, Rutgers, Michigan, and those are teams that Heichel, these guys that we've seen, great coaches go through those programs, and a lot of great tournament success, even within this past decade, have kind of really gone stale. And so a lot of the upside, is with a team like Michigan bringing in a Dusty May, or a team like Indiana, who I think is utilizing the portal to such a great degree. And, Ohio State, you change at the guard, who knows what that brings. It is very up in the air, and to your point, I don't think there's any of those heavy hitters like we had in the past. Certainly Purdue is always going to be consistent under Matt Painter from a wins-loss perspective, but when you lose the best player in the country and a guy who can just dominate that whole section of the floor, that's going to be a lot to overcome in year one. And, for that reason, I think it's anybody's conference here.
Yeah, I really do think so as well. With Purdue, I have a lot of respect for what Matt Painter was able to do last year, finally being able to bust through, make it to the national title game. But I do think that leaves for a lot of upside in terms of some of these teams in the middle of the Big Ten, for Wisconsin. I don't necessarily feel bullish about them, but if they steal a few games in the final possession, who knows? When it's all said and done, they could be towards the top of the Big Ten. And then I was mentioning your school in Iowa. I think they're just such an intriguing team with Peyton Samford going through the NBA draft process, but ultimately coming back. I don't know if they quite have the guard play that we've seen in past years, or bringing in someone in Drew Thelwell that I think is going to be solid. And I do think that depth might be lacking just a little bit on this team as compared to past years. But I take a look at this Iowa bunch, and again, if they could just find a way to be able to be competent on the road, I do think that they have a chance to be able to have themselves a nice year.
Yeah, and offensively, Iowa will never have issues because it's just a scheme that is personnel-proof, especially when you are adding in Peyton Samford, who's coming back, and Owen Freeman, who is going to continue to develop and honestly be one of the best bigs in the Big Ten this year, if not the definitive best Big Ten offensive player in the Big Ten this year. They've got high-low action. They've got a lot of interesting pieces on the back end as well that could really, contribute and get some buckets as well in transition. But it's always kind of what falls back on Iowa is not being able to pick up the stops late in games. And so there's a very high ceiling where they can beat literally anybody on any given day because of how well they shoot the ball, but they can also get run off the floor if those jump shots aren't falling. And last season, it tended to be the latter.
Yeah, it certainly is a team that lives and dies by the three ball. And when it comes to Iowa, how much you get concerned about some of their home and road splits, because that's something that I take a look at so much with both they and so many of these teams in the Big Ten, a conference where already prior to realignment, I always thought it was the ultimate conference in terms of backing teams at home, fading them on the road. And now with adding in those teams from Pac-12, I think that's just going to be magnified even more.
Absolutely. And at a certain point, it's indicative because it's been an issue for Iowa over the last 4 or 5 seasons. I mean, I even think back to the season when they lost to Richmond in the NCAA tournament as the 5 seed going up against the 12 seed Richmond. You know, there was complaints from Iowa players after the game that the balls were too orange and that the rims kind of felt flat. It's just like, what are we doing here? Does everything need to be catered, and is everything just supposed to be perfect and great? That's not what a road environment brings. And so I think that's the mental hurdle that not only just Iowa, but a lot of programs face. And for some reason, it particularly pops up in the Big Ten.
Yeah, the balls being too orange. That is a new one that if you're trying to make that excuse as to why your team lost a game, you should probably be looking at the mirror. As joining me on the show, we do have our good friend Rob Donaldson, who does great work with the show/podcast. Rob says best. Joining me on Coast to Coast Hoops, and certainly I do think that the Big Ten landscape is going to be so intriguing as well. But what else I think is going to be so interesting is taking a look at some of the realignments that we're seeing at the lower level as well, because when you take a look at those Pac-12 teams joining the power conferences, and that gets all the attention. But a few weeks ago, we saw the Southland actually expand a team in Stephen F. Austin. It was solid out there in the WAC, but you could tell that they had taken a step down from when they were in the Southland. They're now back in the Southland, and I think that these are moves that are so intriguing as well, with they and UT Rio Grande Valley joining the Southland. I actually just did my conference preview of that a little bit under a week ago. I do think that that lends for just a little bit of a different landscape out there in both the WAC, and then the Southland becomes a little bit more competitive for a McNeese team that should be able to still run rough through it.
Absolutely, and that's what's exciting about these, changing of the guard. Yes, I am going to miss the Pac-12. I am going to miss some of the, the history of Texas in the Big 12, Oklahoma in the Big 12. But, we adapted. Nebraska and Colorado used to be part of the Big 12 as well. Now Colorado's back, but there used to be a bunch of rivalries that we really got to really go into and enjoy. But the positive of all these changes is that we are getting new unique matchups, especially on the mid-major level, where you do have teams that are kind of lumping up together and creating these conferences that are a lot more competitive. And I think that has been an issue in the mid-major ranks because there's been a lot of conferences that are just a blip on the radar, not even playing the same league of basketball is kind of what it feels like sometimes. I am in favor of conferences getting stronger.
Yep, I am right there with you, because I am noticing a bit of a have and have-nots when it comes to some of these mid-majors, because I look in the Big South, High Point just feels like they're going to be a juggernaut this year. Even with Stephen F. Austin's return, McNeese, they've been able to really build themselves up as a conference, and I'm not sure how you view just the landscape of college basketball, but where I can find just so many great edges is where you do have a conference like the Big West, where it feels like year in and year out. You have a few rock-solid teams like UC Santa Barbara, like UC Irvine. Sometimes you get Cal State Fullerton in there, though it feels like they've went on some tough times as well. And those are some of the conferences I find to be most profitable, where it feels like you sort of have like those 3 to 4 top flight teams. You have a clear tier 2, and then you obviously have like Cal Poly in my example of the Big West in that clear dead last year.
Absolutely. I think you raise a great point, and I do find most of my best value in the mid-major conferences. And because I am a Midwestern guy, the Missouri Valley Conference has always been the conference that I've gravitated towards. And it really helps too to also be a good bettor in those spaces when you want to watch, that product that they're putting out. And the Missouri Valley consistently puts out a great product. And even the Big West, I found myself gravitating over there because it's just on. I don't want to go to bed. It's 10 o'clock on a Wednesday and there's a game being just started at that time. So I have found myself gravitating towards those Big West conferences and the WCC. It is exciting, and definitely 100%. you can find some of the best value in those conferences and those teams in particular that nobody's really looking to bet on.
Yep, absolutely. And what else I think is so interesting as well is utilizing what we see in non-conference play for conference play as well, because you and I are both men that are from the Midwest, and we know this. In the Rising League, there's a very scarce amount of defense that is played. And if we see like a bunch of overs from these teams in the Horizon League, I do think that that could cause for some of the totals to be a little bit too high when it comes to conference play, and vice versa. If you see a team like UW Milwaukee, a team like Wright State play a bunch of unders, typically that means that come the start of conference play, just knowing how a lot of these matchups play out, that could be a really nice advantage to be able to get some overs, just knowing how conference play works in general with these conferences when it comes to that and the early season trends.
Absolutely. And with a great league like the Horizon that you brought up, there's a lot of unique styles, and they are very, very stick to it when they're talking about their styles of play. And so, to your point, if, say, Oakland goes out there and is just dropping 50 points a game in non-con play, well, you're about to reap some really great value once again in the conference play, and Wright State especially, which has always been an offensive juggernaut. I think there's a ton of examples like that outside of even the Horizon throughout a lot of different leagues. And I think that's where you really got to shape your mind of there's non-con betting and then there's in-conference betting, because it is a drastically different playing field, even though you feel like you get to know these teams through the first, month or two of the season.
Yep, absolutely. And I do think that it's going to be so much fun to take a look at what we're going to be getting this upcoming college basketball season. And when it comes to some of the research that you're doing for this upcoming season, has there been a few teams that have been coming across your radar that you're taking a look at and you're feeling either a little bit better about as you do your off-season research, or are there a few teams that you're starting to sour on a little bit?
Well, there's a lot of teams that I'm very intrigued to watch, especially in the mid-major ranks. As you know, I love watching that product, and I think that's where a lot of the value lies. And, last week I brought up Bradley. This week, one of the teams that I'm very high on and a very big believer in is going to be Towson out of the CAA. Obviously, they've been a mainstay over the last few years just from a win-loss perspective, but haven't ever really got over the hump because Charleston has been there. But I do think with Pat Kelsey gone, again, this is a conference that I think is open for grabs, and I think Towson's going to be the team that takes it.
With Towson, they always play such good defense, and they've got a ton of turning out there in the CAA. I think that is going to be such a fun conference. You've got Charleston, who's now going to be under the tutelage of Chris Mack. And after we saw the Kenny Payne era, I think that people out there in Louisville might have a little bit more affinity for Chris Mack and what he was able to do. But that should be such a fun conference. You've always got Hofstra, who need to work on the rebounding a little bit. And then Stony Brook, who was just so profitable last year. So you've got a lot of fun teams out there in the CAA. And I know you, Rob, are doing such a great job getting set for the upcoming college basketball season. Love the good people at home. Know what's all on tap for you and how people are able to follow along on social media and other platforms.
Well, hey, always appreciate you having me on, Greg. And for those who want to follow my daily bets, you can do so on Twitter/X at RobDFB. And I'm also starting to put out more videos for college football on my YouTube, which is just my name, Rob Donaldson. And as always, Greg, really appreciate having me on.
I always appreciate you, Rob, and Rob does such amazing work. Taking a look at this great game that we all know of college basketball, and every single time he joins the show, lends such great insight. So big thanks to Rob for joining me on Coast to Coast Hoops, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. And if you do like hearing from this fine podcast, Coast to Coast Hoops, you're able to subscribe wherever your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. And if you have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, I have one of two ways we offer those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at June_41. Keep in mind, letters DM, they mean does not matter. So as per usual, please do send these into the timeline. And other ways, find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. From there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. Do encourage you guys that if you can, please do fire those in, because we are starting to get to more of a dead period in college basketball right now in terms of player movement, what have you. But we've got you guys covered in terms of a podcast every single day. We are working our way to try to make this the most successful and most profitable season ever. And conference previews are still continuing as well. Going to be doing the Summit League most likely over the weekend. So be on the lookout for that, and be on the lookout for another fresh podcast tomorrow. Thank you so much for tuning in.